For 31 years, Eleanor Hargrove cleaned another family's house, ironed another family's linens, and answered to a name that was never truly her own. Then, 6 months after her mother's funeral, a lawyer she had never met called her into an office and told her that the man she had spent 3 decades serving coffee to was, in fact, her father. What happened next would unravel a secret one dying woman tried to take to her grave, and put Eleanor face to face with the very family that never knew she belonged to them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Eleanor Hargrove was born in a small clapboard house outside Savannah, Georgia, in 1962, the only child of a housekeeper named Josephine Hargrove. Josephine never spoke about Eleanor's father. When Eleanor asked as a little girl, her mother would simply say the same 4 words, "He's not in our lives," and turn back to whatever chore was in front of her. By the time Eleanor was 17, she had learned to stop asking. She finished high school, took a job cleaning houses just as her mother had, and eventually found steady work with a wealthy family named the Winthrops, who owned nearly 4,000 acres of timberland an hour outside the city. She did not know, when she first walked through their front door in 1991, that she had walked into it before, as an infant, wrapped in a blanket her mother never let her see a photograph of. Charles Winthrop was, by every outward account, a hard and private man. He had inherited the family's timber business from his own father and spent 60 years expanding it, all while living alone in a house far too large for one person. Eleanor worked for him for over 3 decades, first as a part-time housekeeper and eventually as the only person he trusted to manage his home entirely. She cooked his meals, organized his mail, and sat with him during the long, quiet stretches after his wife passed away with no children of their own to speak of, at least none that anyone in the Winthrop family had ever been told about. Co-workers would later say that Charles treated Eleanor with an odd, formal gentleness that none of them could quite explain, the kind of care that seemed to run deeper than an employer simply appreciating good work. Josephine Hargrove died in the spring, just 2 years after Charles himself passed away at the age of 84. It was only while going through her mother's belongings that Eleanor found the box. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with kitchen string, a faded photograph of a young Josephine standing beside a young man Eleanor did not immediately recognize, and a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a birth record with a name crossed out in her mother's handwriting. Eleanor sat on the floor of her mother's bedroom for nearly 2 hours before she allowed herself to look closely at the photograph again and realize, with a chill she could not explain, that the young man standing beside her mother was unmistakably Charles Winthrop, 40 years younger, and looking at Josephine the way a person looks at someone they love. At first, Eleanor told no one. She assumed it was simply an old photograph, a coincidence from a time when her mother worked for a different family before the Winthrops. But something about the birth record would not leave her alone. She drove to the county records office the following week and requested a copy of her own birth certificate, something she had never once needed in 59 years of life. What she received back listed no father at all, only a single line reading unknown, in the same clipped municipal handwriting that filled out thousands of records like it. It was the letters, still tied in that kitchen string, that finally gave her the courage to keep going. Because buried in the third one, dated more than 50 years earlier, was a single unmistakable sentence in Charles Winthrop's own handwriting, promising Josephine that he would always take care of their daughter, even if he could never say so out loud. Eleanor did not go to the Winthrop family with the letters right away. Instead, she ordered a DNA testing kit, the same kind millions of ordinary people use to trace holiday ancestry and family trees, and mailed it in without telling a single person what she suspected. The 6 weeks she waited for results were, by her own account, the longest of her life, longer than any illness, longer than her mother's funeral, longer than the loneliest years of her childhood spent wondering who her father might have been. When the results finally arrived, she read them twice before she believed what she was looking at. The report did not simply suggest a distant relation. It confirmed, with a certainty reserved for immediate family, that Eleanor Hargrove was the biological daughter of a man listed in public records as Charles Alden Winthrop. What Eleanor did not yet know was that Charles Winthrop had died without children on paper, which meant his fortune, the land, the timber business, the accounts built over 60 years of quiet, disciplined work, had already begun moving through the courts toward distant cousins who had barely known him and had certainly never once mentioned his name at a holiday table. Those cousins had already hired lawyers. They had already begun dividing, in private conversations, a fortune worth well over $30 million. None of them expected a housekeeper's name to ever appear in that conversation, let alone as the rightful heir standing in front of them with a folder of letters and a DNA report their own lawyers could not explain away. The cousins did not accept the news quietly. Within weeks of Eleanor filing her claim, their attorneys arrived with their own experts, questioning the chain of custody on her DNA sample, questioning the authenticity of letters written more than 5 decades earlier, and questioning, most painfully of all, whether Josephine Hargrove herself had been telling the truth in those private pages or simply writing the story she wished had been real. Eleanor sat through depositions where lawyers she had never met suggested, gently but unmistakably, that a woman who had spent her life cleaning houses might now be inventing a connection to a fortune she had quietly watched grow for 30 years. It was, by every account from those close to her, the first time in her adult life that Eleanor allowed herself to cry in front of strangers. The case turned, in the end, on something none of the cousins' lawyers could argue away, a second DNA sample pulled under court order from a medical specimen Charles Winthrop had left behind during a hospital stay 11 years earlier, still legally preserved and untouched. When the two results were placed side by side in front of a judge, the match was undeniable, 99.9%, the kind of number that ends arguments rather than starting new ones. The distant cousins, who had spent 18 months insisting the housekeeper was chasing a fortune that was never hers to claim, went silent in a courtroom that had, until that morning, been filled with nothing but their objections. Eleanor Hargrove inherited the Winthrop timberland, the family accounts, and a modest brick house on the edge of the property that Charles had, unbeknownst to anyone, quietly placed in a trust bearing her name nearly 20 years before he died, as though some part of him had always intended for the truth to surface eventually, even if he never found the courage to speak it while he was alive. She did not sell the land. She did not move into the grand house where she had spent 31 years dusting shelves and answering a bell that was never once rung for her. Instead, she kept working the property with the same small crew of caretakers Charles had employed for decades, and used a portion of the fortune to fund scholarships in Savannah for children being raised, as she once was, by a single parent who never fully explained where they came from. When a local reporter finally asked Eleanor how it felt to spend 3 decades cleaning a house that, it turned out, had always partly belonged to her, she did not talk about the money, and she did not talk about the courtroom, or the cousins, or the lawyers who had doubted her. She said only that she used to stand at the kitchen window of that house on quiet afternoons and wonder why Charles Winthrop, a man everyone described as cold and unreachable, always seemed to watch her a little longer than he watched anyone else in the room, and that she finally understood, more than 50 years too late, that some people carry the truth their entire lives without ever finding the words to say it out loud, leaving it instead to be discovered, quietly, in a box tied with kitchen string, long after they are gone.